The storm raged through the mountains of Colorado, a merciless force swallowing the land in an endless white abyss. Snow fell in thick sheets, driven by winds that howled like wild beasts prowling in the dark. Trees stood like skeletal sentinels, their branches weighed down by ice bending under the crushing cold. The world had been stripped of color, of warmth, of life. There was no refuge, no mercy, only the storm. The blizzard had erased every trace of movement. No tracks remained in the snow, no sign of life struggling against nature's fury. The mountain road, slick with black ice, twisted through the wilderness like a frozen serpent, nearly invisible beneath the storm's relentless assault. It was a night where nothing should have survived, and yet, amidst the chaos, a single vehicle roared through the storm, a battered pickup truck, its tires skidding dangerously as it fought against the treacherous road. Inside the truck, the driver gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, his face set in grim determination. The passenger beside him shifted uncomfortably, glancing into the truck bed behind them. The tarp covering the cargo flapped violently in the wind, barely concealing what lay beneath it. "We should have done this earlier," the passenger muttered, voice barely audible over the storm. "It doesn't matter," the driver said coldly. "Just get it over with." Without another word, the truck swerved suddenly, coming to a jarring stop near the edge of the road. The passenger threw open the door, boots crunching against ice. He moved quickly to the back, yanking the tarp aside. A pair of wide, frightened eyes stared back at him. A dog, large, thick-furred, and unmistakably pregnant, trembled as she crouched in the truck bed, her ears flattened against her head. She had been loyal, had once believed in the hands that had fed her, the voices that had called her name. But now, as rough hands grabbed her scruff, dragging her toward the edge, she understood. This was betrayal. She struggled, her body writhing against the grip, but the man was stronger. With one final shove, he threw her into the storm. The moment she hit the ground, pain shot through her body. The ice beneath her was unforgiving, sharp as stone. She tumbled down the slope, her legs flailing, her belly heavy with the weight of unborn life. Snow packed into her fur, stinging her skin like tiny knives. When she finally came to a stop at the base of the hill, her breath came in ragged gasps, clouds of white mist escaping her muzzle. Above her, the truck's taillights glowed through the snowfall. She could barely see them, blurred by the storm and the haze creeping into her vision, but she could still hear the engine rev. Then, just like that, the truck disappeared into the night. She lay there for a moment, stunned, her body aching from the fall. The cold seeped into her bones, an unrelenting force, whispering to her that she would not last long. Her thick fur, once meant to withstand the bitter winters, was now her only shield against the unforgiving elements. Her breath shuddered. She wanted to believe she had imagined it, that they would come back, that this was some mistake. But deep down she knew the truth. She had been abandoned. Kaya had trusted them once. She had loved them once. And now they had left her to die. A sharp gust of wind howled through the trees, pushing more snow over her already freezing body. The cold bit at her exposed skin, but it was nothing compared to the ache inside her chest. A dull, suffocating pain, not from the fall, not from the ice, but from something much worse. Betrayal. She could not afford to lie there. The storm was relentless, uncaring. If she did not move, it would bury her alive, and not just her, her puppies. A spark of something fierce ignited within her. She was not alone. Kaya forced her legs to move, pushing against the snow that tried to swallow her whole. Every step sent another jolt of pain through her limbs, but she gritted her teeth and pressed forward. The wind lashed against her face, but she kept going. She would not let them take her pups away before they had a chance to live. She did not know how long she walked. Time lost meaning in the white abyss. Her paws burned from the cold. Her breaths grew shallower with each step. The snowfall blurred everything around her, turning the world into an endless void. But she did not stop. Then, through the blinding storm, she saw it. A break in the relentless white, a shadow among the trees. Kaya staggered toward it, a desperate hope driving her forward. As she neared, she realized it was a cave, small, barely noticeable beneath the overhanging rocks. Salvation. With the last of her strength, she stumbled inside. The wind could not reach her here. The snow could no longer bury her. But the battle was far from over. The first wave of pain came suddenly, a deep, wrenching contraction that sent her body shuddering. Instinct took over. She turned in tight circles, her body preparing for what was to come. She panted heavily, her muscles trembling. The storm raged outside, but Kaya had no time to fear it now. She was bringing life into a world that had tried to destroy her. Hours passed. The pain was unbearable, the exhaustion crushing. But when the final contraction rippled through her body, she felt the warmth of 6 tiny bodies nestled against her stomach. They were small, fragile, barely aware of the storm that threatened to steal them away. Kaya curled around them, pulling them close, sharing every bit of warmth she had left. The blizzard screamed through the night, trying to drown them. But Kaya had survived worse. She had been cast out, left to freeze, to starve, to disappear beneath the snow. But she would not let her puppies die. They had abandoned her, but she would never abandon them. The storm raged on. But inside the cave, beneath the warmth of their mother, 6 tiny lives flickered against the darkness. Kaya closed her eyes, her breath steady, her heart still strong. They had survived the night. Tomorrow, she would fight again. The wind howled outside, rattling the small windows of the remote weather station. Inside, the dim glow of a single desk lamp flickered over stacks of old reports, scattered tools, and a half-empty mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The room felt sterile, untouched by warmth, much like the man sitting in the worn-out chair at the far end of the cabin. Jason Miller had spent the last 5 years in isolation, buried in numbers, storm patterns, and temperature fluctuations, anything that kept him from thinking about the past. At 40, he had once been a respected climate researcher for NASA, a man who had devoted his life to understanding nature's raw and untamed forces. But nature had taken everything from him. The memory struck him like a cold gust of wind, a blinding wall of white, the deafening roar of an avalanche, the sheer inescapable terror in his wife's voice as she screamed his name. The weight of helplessness crushed him just as the snow had buried them. He had spent days digging, his hands raw, his body broken, only to find nothing. A hollow ache settled in his chest as he exhaled, running a hand through his unkempt hair. He had long since stopped looking for meaning in anything outside of his work. He wasn't here to make a difference. He was here because this station, this secluded prison at the edge of civilization, was the only place where no one expected him to care. The screens in front of him glowed with real-time weather updates, streams of data tracking the storm that raged across the Colorado mountains. It was one of the worst blizzards in recent years, a storm that could bury anything, or anyone, caught in its path. A sharp beep suddenly broke the monotonous hum of the machines. Jason frowned. A temperature anomaly. He leaned forward, adjusting the thermal sensors, eyes narrowing at the irregular spike in heat readings. At first he assumed it was a glitch. The storm had disrupted his equipment before. But as he recalibrated the system, the anomaly remained, a heat signature moving through the snow, slowly, struggling. Jason pulled up the live feed from the station's external cameras. The screen flickered before settling into a grainy, snow-covered view of the outside world. Nothing but a swirling mass of white at first. Then, movement. A dark shape against the endless frost. Small, fragile. A dog. Jason stiffened, watching as the figure stumbled through the snow, dragging something behind it. He adjusted the angle of the camera, zooming in. It was a mother dog, her fur matted with ice, her breath labored as she fought against the storm. Her movements were slow, unsteady, but determined. She was pulling something through the snow. Jason's stomach clenched. He enhanced the image. Puppies. A tightness formed in his throat as he watched the mother stop abruptly, her body trembling from exhaustion. She turned her head toward the camera, her amber eyes locking onto his. Jason inhaled sharply. He knew that look. It was not the look of an animal merely lost in the snow. It was something far more human, something raw and desperate. She was pleading. For a long moment, he simply stared at the screen, his mind a storm of its own. Not my problem. The thought came fast, instinctive. He wasn't responsible for her. He hadn't been responsible for anything outside of this station for years. He reached for the thermal monitor, ready to shut it off. But his hand hesitated. A memory crashed into him, unbidden and violent. Not of snow, not of ice, but of another set of eyes, his daughter's. Wide, frightened, looking up at him just before the avalanche swallowed their world whole. "Daddy!" The scream echoed through his mind, ripping through his carefully constructed walls. Jason gritted his teeth, forcing the memory back, his hands curling into fists. That day, he had been too far. That day, he hadn't been able to do anything. But today, he was right here. The storm outside raged on, indifferent, relentless. Jason swallowed hard, shoving back his chair. The legs scraped against the wooden floor as he stood. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs, his pulse erratic, but his mind was made up. For the first time in years, he was choosing to act. He reached for his heavy coat, pulling it over his shoulders. His fingers found the flashlight, the emergency thermal blanket, the gloves he hadn't bothered using in weeks. By the time he reached the door, the blizzard was screaming like a living thing. He could feel the cold trying to claw its way through the cracks in the cabin's walls. His hand hesitated over the door handle. Jason took a deep breath. Then, without another thought, he stepped into the storm. The wind hit him like a wall, stealing his breath instantly. Snow stung against his face, biting through his layers of clothing. He hunched his shoulders and pressed forward, the beam of his flashlight barely cutting through the white void ahead. Every step was a battle. The wind roared in his ears, and for a fleeting second he wondered if this was what it had felt like. For them, for his wife, for his daughter, swallowed by the cold, calling his name, waiting for him to come. Jason clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the flashlight. Not this time. He pushed forward, tracking the coordinates from the camera feed, his boots sinking deep into the snow. The visibility was nearly non-existent, but he knew she was out there, and he wasn't going back without her. The storm screamed around him, as if trying to bury the past along with everything else. But Jason Miller was done turning his back on the world. Somewhere ahead, a mother dog and her puppies were clinging to life, and he would find them, no matter what it took. Jason braced himself as he stepped deeper into the blizzard, the wind roaring like a living beast around him. Snow lashed against his face, sharp as glass, seeping into every exposed inch of skin. The cold was relentless, digging its claws through his thick coat, gnawing at his bones with every step. He had underestimated the storm's fury. The snow was already knee-deep, and each movement felt like trudging through quicksand. His breath came out in sharp, shallow gasps, turning to mist the moment it left his lips. For a moment, a flicker of doubt crept in. Had he made a mistake? Was he truly ready to do this? But then he remembered the look in the dog's eyes, the silent plea that had gripped something deep inside him. She was out here. She was waiting. He had to keep moving. The flashlight beam barely pierced the thick snowfall, the world ahead shifting in a swirling blur of white. His boots slipped on hidden patches of ice beneath the snow, forcing him to catch himself against the wind. The storm was trying to push him back, to erase his path just as it had erased hers, but Jason refused to stop. His hands were stiff, nearly frozen even beneath his gloves. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket, checking the GPS coordinates he had marked from the thermal cameras. He was close. Somewhere ahead, buried beneath the suffocating white abyss, a mother dog was fighting for survival. He pushed forward. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time had lost all meaning in the endless cold. Then, through the thick curtain of snow, a dark shape emerged in the distance. Jason's pulse quickened. He lifted his flashlight, the beam catching on something huddled in the snow near the base of a rock formation. A dog, Kaya. She lay curled around something, barely visible beneath the layer of frost clinging to her thick fur. Her body was rigid, shielding what lay beneath her. The wind had nearly buried them. If Jason had been even a little later, he pushed the thought away. Kaya's ears flicked at the sound of his approaching footsteps. Slowly, she raised her head. Her amber eyes, wide and filled with exhaustion, locked onto him. Jason froze. She didn't move. She didn't growl or snarl, but she didn't run either. She was watching him, judging, deciding. He took a cautious step forward, keeping his voice low despite the wind screaming around them. "I'm not going to hurt you," he murmured, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. "I just want to help." Kaya flinched slightly, but she didn't retreat. Jason lowered himself onto one knee, moving slowly, keeping his hands visible. Up close, he could see the toll the storm had taken on her. Ice clung to her whiskers, her fur stiff with frost. Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling from the effort of keeping her pups warm. She had given everything to protect them, and she was losing the fight. Jason swallowed, his heart tightening. He shifted his flashlight toward the small bodies nestled against her stomach. 6 tiny pups, barely visible in the dim light, their fur dusted with frost. They were so small. Too small for this kind of cold. Jason reached out carefully, his gloved hands shaking from both the cold and the weight of the moment. Would she let him? For a second, Kaya tensed. Then she let out a soft exhale and lowered her head. Jason felt a lump rise in his throat. She was trusting him. He moved quickly but gently. One by one, he lifted the fragile bodies, tucking them carefully inside his thick coat, pressing them close against his chest. The warmth of his body was their only chance now. He could barely feel their tiny movements against him, their breath faint, almost imperceptible. "Come on, little ones," he murmured, adjusting his coat to shield them from the wind. "Stay with me." Just as he secured the last pup, something grabbed his pant leg. Jason jolted, looking down. Kaya had latched onto him with her teeth, not biting but holding him in place. Confused, he followed her gaze to the snow behind her. At first, he saw nothing, just more white. Then his breath caught. A small mound, slightly uneven, something buried just beneath the surface. Jason's stomach dropped. One was missing. Panic shot through him as he immediately began digging, his fingers clawing through the snow despite the cold biting into his skin. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He had already lost too much in his life. He wasn't about to lose another. His hands struck fur. Jason's pulse pounded in his ears as he lifted the motionless puppy from the snow, cradling the tiny body in his hands. It was ice cold. "No, no, no," Jason whispered. There was no movement, no breath, but there was still a chance. Without hesitation, Jason pressed the puppy against his chest, wrapping his arms around it, shielding it with his own body heat. He rubbed its tiny frame with his gloved hands, willing warmth back into it. "Come on, little guy. You're not giving up on me." Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, a twitch. Jason's breath hitched. Another twitch. A faint, shuddering breath, Relief crashed into him like a wave. "That's it," he murmured, his voice tight. "Stay with me." He held the pup closer, feeling the faint rise and fall of its tiny chest. It was weak, but it was breathing. Kaya whimpered, stepping forward. She nudged Jason's coat, pressing her cold nose against where her pups were hidden inside. She was checking on them. Jason let out a shaky breath. "They're okay. I've got them." Kaya hesitated. Then, for the first time, she made a choice. She stepped closer, pressing her side against Jason's leg, not out of fear, but out of trust. Jason's throat tightened. He slowly stood, adjusting the puppies against his chest. The wind howled louder, the storm pressing in around them. They had to move. Jason turned toward the distant glow of his cabin. He took a step forward. Kaya followed, not because she was forced, but because for the first time she had chosen to believe in a human again. And Jason, after years of shutting the world out, chose to believe in her too. The storm raged on, but together they stepped forward into the unknown, toward survival, toward something neither of them had dared hope for. A second chance. Jason sat quietly in the small veterinary clinic, his arms crossed, his fingers tapping against his sleeve in restless anticipation. The storm outside had finally settled, but inside, his mind churned like the blizzard that had nearly taken Kaya and her pups. Across the room, Dr. Sarah Whitmore, a veterinarian with sharp eyes and a steady hand, carefully examined Kaya. The dog lay still on the padded table, her body exhausted but her golden eyes alert, watching everything with quiet wariness. The puppies, now safe and wrapped in warm blankets, rested inside a heating incubator nearby, their tiny chests rising and falling in steady, rhythmic motions. "She's lucky to have made it through that storm," Sarah murmured, running her hands over Kaya's frame, checking for any hidden injuries. "And the puppies. I don't know how she kept them alive in that cold. It's a miracle." Jason exhaled, his gaze lingering on Kaya. He had seen determination before, on the faces of firefighters, first responders, people pushing beyond their limits to save lives, but he had never seen it so clearly in an animal. She had fought against the impossible, refusing to let the storm take what was hers. But something still didn't make sense. His thoughts were interrupted when Sarah suddenly froze. Jason straightened. "What is it?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She had pushed back Kaya's fur, her fingers tracing something beneath the thick coat of her neck. A marking. Jason leaned in, his pulse quickening. It wasn't just a scar. It was engraved, a small, precise sequence of numbers and letters. A code. "This isn't normal," Sarah muttered, grabbing a tablet from the counter. She typed the sequence into her database, her expression darkening as she worked. Jason watched the screen, tension knotting in his chest. He had seen enough classified reports in his time to know when something wasn't supposed to exist. The screen flashed red. Then another line of text appeared. "Unauthorized access attempt detected. Sensitive data classified under federal protection." Sarah's face paled. Jason felt a slow, growing unease creep through him. "What the hell does that mean?" Sarah swallowed, her voice quieter now. "It means someone doesn't want this information getting out." Jason turned back to Kaya, his mind racing. "She's not just a stray." "No," Sarah agreed. "She's something else entirely." Jason leaned back, his jaw tightening. He had spent years studying environmental shifts, reading reports about biological modifications in animals, and even hearing whispers of corporate experiments pushing past ethical lines. But this was personal now. He folded his arms, exhaling sharply. "Tell me everything." Sarah hesitated, but then pulled up a secondary file, one not connected to the restricted database. "There's been talk, nothing proven, but rumors, about a company called BlackRock Genetics." Jason frowned. The name was unfamiliar, but something about it sent a chill down his spine. Sarah continued. They specialize in genetic modifications. Unofficially, of course. Most of their projects never see public records. They've worked with high-end sled dogs, military K9 units, and experimental endurance breeds. They don't just train animals, they modify them. Jason's fingers curled into fists. And Kaya? Sarah sighed. If she has this kind of marking, then she wasn't just any dog. She was engineered for something specific. Jason shook his head. Then why dump her? Why throw her out into a storm to die? Sarah hesitated before answering. Because she got pregnant. Jason stilled. Sarah tapped on the screen. There's a theory that BlackRock was experimenting with enhanced genetics, modifying working dogs for extreme endurance. But if she got pregnant outside of controlled conditions, she became a liability. Jason felt something burn deep in his chest. So they just... What? Tossed her away like garbage. Sarah's expression was grim. If they terminated the project, they wouldn't want any evidence left behind. They probably assumed she wouldn't survive in a storm like that. Jason clenched his jaw. He looked at Kaya, who had settled her head on her paws, watching them with quiet intensity. She had no idea what they had done to her, what she had been through, only that she had to fight to protect her young. She had been created for their purposes, used until she was inconvenient, and then discarded. A slow rage ignited in Jason's chest. "We can't just let this go," he said, his voice tight. Sarah glanced at him. "What are you thinking?" Jason looked at Kaya again, watching the steady rise and fall of her breath. They threw her away because they thought she wouldn't make it. His gaze hardened. But she did. And now, so had her story. The air inside the small veterinary clinic felt heavy, thick with tension. Jason could still hear the distant howl of the wind outside, though the blizzard had finally begun to ease. Inside, the dim glow of the overhead light cast long shadows across the examination room, where Kaya lay curled protectively around her pups, her breathing slow but steady. She was safe, for now. Across the room, Sarah stood by the counter, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard as she attempted to access more files on BlackRock genetics. Jason leaned over her shoulder, watching the screen flicker as she bypassed security protocols, her brows furrowed in concentration. "This isn't just some rogue operation," she muttered. "BlackRock's been careful. There are hardly any leaks, no public records that tie them to direct genetic testing on animals. But this..." She pointed at the warning still flashing on her screen. "Unauthorized access attempt detected." Jason didn't need to be a cybersecurity expert to know what that meant. "They know we're looking," he said flatly. Sarah swallowed, her eyes darting to him. "We need to report this now, before..." A sharp noise outside cut her off. Jason's instincts kicked in immediately. He moved quickly, stepping toward the window, keeping his body low as he peered through the half-frozen glass. Headlights. A vehicle had pulled up just beyond the edge of the property. The taillights glowed faintly through the thinning snowfall, idling like a predator watching its prey. His jaw clenched. "We have company." Sarah shut her laptop instantly, heart pounding. "You think it's them?" Jason didn't answer. He was already moving, pulling on his coat, securing the pups in their insulated crate, double-checking that Kaya was ready to move. "Jason," Sarah urged, "we should wait for the police?" "They might not have time to get here," Jason cut in. His voice was calm, but his muscles were taut, ready. "And we're not waiting to find out what happens if those guys get here first." Sarah exhaled sharply, knowing he was right. Whoever was in that car wasn't just watching. They were waiting. And waiting was never a good sign. Jason yanked open the door of his truck, his movements swift and precise. The vehicle was old, but reliable, a sturdy, all-terrain truck built for conditions like this. He set the insulated crate carefully in the passenger seat, ensuring the pups were secure before looking down at Kaya. She jumped in without hesitation, settling herself protectively in front of them. Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, her hands fumbling as she secured her seatbelt. "Tell me you've done this before." Jason's hands gripped the wheel as he started the engine, his eyes flicking to the dark SUV now pulling onto the road behind them. "Something like it," he muttered. Then, without another word, he threw the truck into gear and hit the gas. The tires spun for half a second before catching traction on the icy road, propelling them forward. Snow kicked up behind them, a cloud of white mist swallowing the truck's taillights as they tore down the narrow mountain road. The SUV followed. Sarah turned in her seat, glancing over her shoulder, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. "They're speeding up!" Jason didn't acknowledge her. He was too focused, scanning the road ahead, anticipating the curves and the hidden patches of ice that could send them skidding off the edge. The SUV inched closer. Jason's grip on the wheel tightened. "They're trying to push us off the road." Sarah's breath hitched. "Are they crazy?" Jason's jaw was set. "They're desperate." Ahead, the road narrowed, flanked on one side by a steep incline and on the other by a sheer drop into the trees below. If their pursuers wanted to force them off the road, this was the perfect place to do it. The SUV swerved, inching dangerously close to Jason's truck. A deep, warning growl rumbled from the passenger seat. Jason glanced down. Kaya's body was tense, her ears pinned forward, her golden eyes locked onto something ahead. Then, she barked, loud, urgent. Jason's gaze snapped forward. Through the blowing snow, barely visible beneath the tree line, a narrow, unmarked road veered sharply to the right, a path hidden from plain sight, leading down into the dense forest. Kaya barked again, her body leaning forward. Jason didn't hesitate. "Hold on," he warned. Sarah barely had time to suck in a breath before Jason jerked the wheel right. The truck's tires slid, snow spraying up as they veered off the main road and onto the narrow, unpaved path. The suspension jolted as they hit uneven ground, but Jason kept control, guiding the vehicle through the dense underbrush. Behind them, the SUV overshot the turn. Sarah twisted in her seat, watching as the dark vehicle skidded wildly, its tires struggling for grip on the icy surface. For a second, it looked like it might regain control. Then, it vanished from sight. Jason heard the screech of metal, the crunch of snow and ice. Then, silence. His hands remained steady on the wheel, but his breath came out slower now, his chest heaving from the rush of adrenaline. Sarah let out a shaky exhale. "Did they?" Jason didn't take his eyes off the road. "Doesn't matter." A beat of silence. Then, a soft whimper from the crate beside him. Jason's focus shifted immediately. Kaya had turned around, sniffing at her puppies, checking them. They were frightened, but safe. She turned back to Jason, and for the first time he could see it in her eyes. She trusted him. Jason swallowed hard, his fingers loosening on the wheel. "We're not out of this yet," he murmured. But for the first time that night, he believed they might actually make it. He glanced once more at Kaya, his mind replaying what had just happened. She had saved them, and he had trusted her. For the first time in a long, long time, Jason had trusted something other than himself. He pressed forward, driving deeper into the forest, leaving the storm, the hunters, and his past behind. For now. But he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Jason tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he drove through the darkened streets of the city. The towering skyline was a stark contrast to the icy wilderness he had left behind just days ago. The storm had nearly taken their lives, but now a different kind of battle awaited him, one that couldn't be fought against the elements. Beside him, Sarah sat with her laptop open, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. They had spent the last 24 hours gathering every piece of evidence they had. Medical records, thermal footage, data on BlackRock's classified projects. It was all there, laid bare in front of them. They just needed someone to listen. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, breaking the tense silence. Jason's jaw was set, his expression unreadable. "We don't have a choice." Sarah exhaled, glancing back at the crate where Kaya and her puppies lay nestled together. Kaya lifted her head slightly, her golden eyes flickering with quiet understanding. She had survived against impossible odds, and now she was the key to exposing everything. Jason pulled into the parking lot of a local news station, its neon sign glowing in the night. He killed the engine and turned to Sarah. "Let's end this." The newsroom was quieter than expected, the late hour ensuring only a skeleton crew remained. A young reporter, Ethan Hall, looked up from his desk as Jason and Sarah approached. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in their exhausted appearances. "You said you had a story?" Ethan asked, folding his arms. Jason nodded. "One that's going to change everything." Sarah placed her laptop on his desk and pulled up the files. She clicked on the first document, a veterinary report confirming Kaya's genetic modifications. "This is Kaya," she said, tilting her head toward the Malamute resting on the floor. "She was part of a classified genetic project under BlackRock Genetics." Ethan arched a brow. "BlackRock? The biotech firm?" Jason nodded. "They've been experimenting on working dogs, sled teams, search and rescue units, even military canines. They've been genetically enhancing them, testing endurance and strength under extreme conditions." Ethan leaned in slightly. "And what's the problem?" Sarah's fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up a different file, one that made Ethan's expression shift from curiosity to disbelief. "They don't just experiment on them," she said. "They discard them when they're no longer useful." She clicked on a grainy image pulled from Jason's thermal camera footage, the moment Kaya had been fighting her way through the blizzard, dragging her near-frozen puppies behind her. Jason spoke, his voice laced with quiet anger. "She wasn't supposed to survive. They dumped her in the middle of a storm to erase the evidence of her pregnancy." Ethan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "You have proof?" Sarah nodded. "We have veterinary scans showing unnatural muscle density, heightened resistance to cold, markers of genetic interference. We also have data logs that match Kaya's identification code to BlackRock's research projects." Ethan let out a slow breath. "And the puppies?" Jason glanced at Kaya, who was now watching Ethan carefully, as if understanding that this moment would determine their fate. "They're the reason she survived," Jason murmured. "They thought she was just another test subject, but she wasn't. She was a mother, and she wasn't going to let them die." Ethan ran a hand down his face. "This is insane. If this gets out—" Jason cut him off. "It needs to get out." Ethan hesitated only a second longer before reaching for his phone. "I have a contact in law enforcement. If what you're saying is true, they'll be all over this." Jason exchanged a glance with Sarah. They had done their part. Now, it was up to the world to see the truth. The next 24 hours were a blur. By morning, news outlets were running the story nationwide. Footage of Kaya, exhausted but alive, her puppies nestled safely against her, flashed across TV screens. Reports exposed BlackRock's unethical testing, their genetic manipulation experiments, and their complete disregard for the animals they had used. The public erupted in outrage. Animal rights organizations demanded action. Activists took to the streets. The government had no choice but to respond. By noon, federal investigators raided BlackRock's research facility. Jason and Sarah watched the footage live, standing in front of the news station's screens as agents swarmed the corporate headquarters. "They're bringing them out," Sarah murmured, pointing at the screen. Jason's chest tightened as he saw them, rows of cages filled with dogs just like Kaya, some barely able to stand, their bodies weak from years of experimentation. One by one, they were carried out of the facility, taken into the care of rescue organizations. Jason exhaled, his grip on his coffee mug loosening. "It's over." Sarah nodded. "For them, maybe." She turned to him, her eyes softening. "But what about you?" Jason didn't answer immediately. He looked down at Kaya, who sat beside him, her ears twitching as she watched the screen. She had fought for her life, for her puppies, for the chance to be more than just an experiment. She had trusted him. And now, for the first time in years, Jason realized he had done something that mattered again. He reached down, running his fingers through Kaya's thick fur. "We go home," he said simply. Kaya let out a soft huff, pressing her nose against his palm. Home. For the first time in a long time, Jason actually felt like he had one. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the wooden walls of Jason's cabin. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the landscape in white. But the storm had long passed. Inside, for the first time in years, there was warmth, not just from the fire, but from something deeper, something Jason hadn't felt in a long, long time. He sat in his worn-out armchair, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, watching 6 tiny puppies nestled together on a thick blanket by the fire. Their small bodies rose and fell in steady, peaceful rhythm, their soft whimpers barely audible over the crackling wood. And then there was Kaya. She lay nearby, her golden eyes half closed but still alert, as if ensuring that everything was truly safe. She had spent so long fighting, so long surviving, but now she didn't have to anymore. Jason exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. The last few weeks had changed everything. He had walked away from the world, built a life in isolation, convinced himself that he no longer needed anyone. But then Kaya had appeared, a mother who refused to give up, who fought against the odds, who chose to trust him when she had every reason not to. And somehow, in saving her, she had saved him too. Jason leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. As if sensing the shift in his thoughts, Kaya lifted her head and looked at him. For a moment, they just watched each other, man and dog, both survivors of different storms. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, Kaya pushed herself up and padded toward him. She stopped right in front of his chair, hesitating just a second before gently resting her head on his knee. Jason stilled. It was such a simple gesture. But he understood what it meant. She trusted him, completely. His chest tightened, warmth spreading through him, not from the fire, but from something he had thought was lost forever. He smiled, a quiet, genuine smile that felt foreign on his face, but natural all the same. "Welcome home, Kaya," he murmured. And for the first time in years, his house was no longer empty. It was a home again. This heartwarming story is more than just a tale of survival. It's a testament to the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, the resilience of life, and the power of second chances. In a world that often forgets the silent loyalty of creatures who ask for nothing but love, dog stories like this remind us that trust is something earned, not given. Kaya's journey is not just about enduring the harshest conditions, but about choosing to believe in kindness despite past betrayals. Her unwavering determination to protect her puppies mirrors the very essence of love, selfless, fierce, and unyielding. And in Jason, we see a man rediscovering what it means to care again, proving that even the most closed-off hearts can find warmth when they least expect it. Stories like this hold a profound message, that no life is disposable, that loyalty should never be repaid with abandonment, and that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a four-legged companion who refuses to give up. Dog stories have a way of touching something deep within us, reminding us that the simplest acts, offering shelter, showing kindness, choosing to trust, can make all the difference. At its core, this is a story about redemption, about how love, whether from a person or an animal, has the power to heal wounds, mend broken spirits, and create a home where there was once only emptiness. And perhaps it reminds us all to never turn away from a soul in need, because in saving them, we may just save ourselves too. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.